Lieutenant Mike Roberts had been drifting to the outer rim of the Kepler system for 3 days when his scanner picked up the massive shadow. At first, he thought it was an asteroid, but asteroids don't move in perfect straight lines at impossible speeds. His blood went cold as he recognized the distinctive hull markings he'd only seen in classified briefings back on Earth. Rex hunting ship. Mike's fingers flew over his controls, trying to bring his small scout vessel around, but it was already too late. The alien ship was easily 10 times the size of his craft, bristling with weapons and technology that made human engineering look like stone tools. A pale blue beam shot out from the enemy vessel, and suddenly Mike's ship wasn't his anymore. The tractor beam locked onto his hull with a sound like thunder. Every system on his dashboard went red, then dark. His engines died. Life support flickered. Even his emergency beacon fell silent. Mike found himself being pulled helplessly toward the gaping mouth of the alien cargo bay like a fish on a line. He'd heard the stories from the few human survivors who'd escaped Rex capture. The insect-like aliens had been prowling human space for months, snatching up explorers, traders, and military scouts. They didn't want prisoners for information or hostages for bargaining. They wanted test subjects, live specimens to study in their laboratories before disposing of them in the most efficient way possible. Mike's scout ship scraped against metal as it was dragged into the alien vessel. Through his viewports, he could see rows of other captured ships, some human, others from species he didn't recognize. All empty now, all silent. The cargo bay door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach drop. Atmosphere flooded the space around his ship. At least he could breathe for now. But Mike knew that wouldn't last long. Heavy footsteps echoed against his hull. Through the small porthole, he caught his first glimpse of his captors. The Vrex stood nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies covered in dark, chitinous armor that looked like it had grown rather than been manufactured. Their heads were elongated and insect-like, with massive compound eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw, for arms ended in hands that were more like claws, perfect for tearing and cutting. 2 of the soldiers used some kind of energy tool to slice through his ship's hull like it was paper. The metal peeled back with a screech that hurt his ears. One of the creatures reached in with surprising gentleness and pulled Mike out of his pilot seat. Its claws, each as long as his fingers, pressed against his arms just hard enough to let him know that resistance would be futile. They dragged him through corridors that seemed designed for creatures much larger than humans. The walls were covered in a strange, organic-looking metal that pulsed with dim, bioluminescent patterns. The air smelled like ozone and something else he couldn't identify, something chemical and sharp that made his nose burn. Other Vrex watched him pass, their compound eyes tracking his movement with the cold interest of scientists observing a lab rat. Some made clicking sounds that might have been communication, or might have been amusement. Mike had never felt so much like prey in his entire life. They stopped at a heavy door that slid open to reveal what was obviously a laboratory. Banks of alien instruments lined the walls, humming with energy. In the center of the room sat a transparent chamber about the size of a phone booth, already filling with yellow gas that hissed as it poured from vents in the ceiling. The lead scientist approached, its mandibles clicking rapidly in what Mike guessed was excitement. It was smaller than the soldiers, but somehow more frightening, with additional mechanical attachments grafted onto its natural limbs and sensors where its eyes should have been. Through some kind of translation device, its voice buzzed in Mike's head. This atmospheric compound dissolves carbon-based tissue in 30 seconds. We will observe the decomposition process for our records. The soldiers shoved Mike into the chamber before he could react. The door sealed with an airtight hiss, trapping him inside with the deadly yellow fog that was already making his eyes water and his throat burn. Mike pressed himself against the far wall of the chamber, his heart hammering in his chest. Around him, the Vrex scientists settled in to watch him die, their instruments recording every second of what they expected to be a very short and educational show. But Mike Roberts had survived 2 tours in the Antarctic research stations, a crash landing on Mars, and 3 different kinds of military survival training that most people considered impossible. The Vrex were about to learn that humans don't die as easily as they thought. The yellow gas burned Mike's throat like liquid fire as he took his first breath inside the death chamber. Every instinct screamed at him to panic, to bang on the walls, to beg for mercy. Instead, he did what every human learns to do when facing impossible odds. He adapted. Mike ripped off his outer jacket and tore it into long strips, wrapping them around his face to create a makeshift filter. The fabric wouldn't stop the poison completely, but it might buy him a few precious minutes. He pressed himself into the corner farthest from the gas vents, trying to find any pocket of cleaner air in the swirling yellow death trap. Outside the chamber, he could see the Vrex scientists watching him through their instruments. They were clicking their mandibles together in what he was starting to recognize as their version of excited chatter, probably taking bets on how long it would take for his organs to dissolve. But minutes passed, and Mike kept breathing. The lead scientist moved closer to the chamber, its sensor-covered head tilting in what might have been confusion. It tapped one of its clawed hands against the display screen, then tapped again harder. The readings weren't making sense. According to their instruments, the human should have been nothing but liquid by now. Mike forced himself to slow down his breathing, just like his survival instructors had taught him during the brutal training exercises in the Colorado mountains. Back then, Sergeant Williams used to say that panic was just oxygen being wasted on fear. Your body can survive on a lot less than you think, Roberts, the old soldier had growled. But your brain needs to be in charge, not your emotions. So Mike put his brain in charge. He slowed his heart rate using the meditation techniques he'd learned during his deep space training. His body began consuming oxygen more efficiently, making each breath count for more. The burning in his lungs was still there, but became manageable, like the ache of a hard workout rather than the agony of dying. The Vrex were definitely confused now. Mike could hear them clicking and buzzing at each other through the chamber walls. One of the smaller scientists was frantically adjusting controls, while another was running some kind of scanning device over the gas mixture itself, as if checking whether they'd mixed the wrong chemicals. Hours passed. Mike had settled into a rhythm, breathing slowly and steadily through his improvised filter. He'd found that by staying perfectly still, he could minimize how much of the toxic atmosphere he needed to process. His military training had included survival scenarios that most people consider torture, being buried in sand for hours, floating in ice water until hypothermia set in, staying awake for days straight while being bombarded with noise and lights. This was just another test, and humans were very good at tests. The lead scientist was clearly agitated now. It had called in additional researchers, and they were all pointing at Mike like he was some kind of magic trick they couldn't figure out. Through his watering eyes, Mike could see them consulting what looked like reference materials, probably checking their data on human physiology. That's when the lead scientist made his decision. Mike heard his mechanical voice buzz through the translation system. Increase concentration by 300%. Fresh vents opened in the ceiling, pouring even more yellow death into the chamber. The new mixture was so concentrated that it looked almost solid, like swimming through liquid sulfur. Mike's eyes immediately started streaming tears, and the burning in his throat intensified to the point where swallowing felt like eating broken glass. But he didn't panic. He adjusted his breathing filter, tearing off more fabric from his shirt to layer over the original mask. He found a position where he could brace himself against the wall and minimize his movement even further. Most importantly, he went deeper into the meditative state that had gotten him through every impossible situation the military had ever thrown at him. The Vrex scientists were practically vibrating with confusion now. Their instruments were screaming warnings about the toxicity levels in the chamber, levels that should have killed any known form of life within seconds. Yet the human was still there, still breathing, still staring back at them with those strange, determined eyes that seemed to hold secrets they couldn't understand. One of the younger scientists approached the lead researcher, clicking nervously. Mike couldn't understand their language, but their body language was universal. They were asking if something had gone wrong with their equipment, if their famous killing chamber had somehow malfunctioned. But Mike knew the truth that was slowly dawning on his captors. Their equipment was working perfectly. They simply had no idea what humans were capable of when survival was on the line. They'd built their death trap for creatures like themselves, creatures that gave up when conditions became impossible. Humans, on the other hand, had spent millions of years learning that impossible just meant you had to try harder. The Vrex scientists huddled around their control panels, like doctors trying to solve a medical mystery. For 6 hours, They watched their supposedly foolproof death chamber fail to kill a single human. Their reputation as the galaxy's most efficient exterminators was starting to crumble, and they were getting desperate. The lead scientist's mechanical voice crackled through the translation system again. Equipment malfunction suspected. Initiating secondary termination protocols. Mike felt a familiar tingling sensation crawl across his skin, starting at his fingertips and spreading up his arms. Radiation. He'd experienced it before during his training on the lunar research stations, where solar flares could cook an unprotected human in minutes. The Vrex were flooding his chamber with enough radioactive energy to kill their own armored warriors. But Mike had advantages his captors didn't understand. During his years working in space, he'd been exposed to low-level radiation constantly. His body had developed better repair mechanisms than most humans. More importantly, he knew how to work with what he had. The chamber floor was littered with pieces of metal debris from previous experiments. Mike quickly gathered the heaviest chunks, stacking them between himself and the radiation emitters he could identify on the walls. The metal wouldn't stop everything, but it would absorb enough of the deadly energy to keep him breathing. He positioned himself in the shadow of his improvised shield, making himself as small as possible. The Vrex watched their radiation detectors climb to lethal levels, then waited for the inevitable collapse. Minutes passed, then an hour. Mike remained conscious, occasionally shifting his position to stay behind his metal barrier, but otherwise showing no signs of radiation sickness that should have killed him 3 times over. The younger scientists were clicking frantically now, pointing at their instruments and then at Mike like he was breaking the laws of physics. One of them actually struck his control panel with a clawed fist, as if that might make the readings change. The lead scientist's compound eyes focused on Mike with what looked like growing anger. If poison gas wouldn't work and radiation had failed, then perhaps simple physics would succeed where chemistry had not. The gravity generators hummed to life. Mike felt his weight triple instantly. His knees buckled, and he dropped to the floor with a crash that knocked the wind out of his lungs. The Vrex had cranked the artificial gravity to 6 times Earth normal, enough to crush most living creatures into paste. Mike's vision blurred as blood struggled to reach his brain against the incredible downward pull. But humans had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them in every possible way. Their bones were dense, their muscles tough, and their cardiovascular systems remarkably adaptable. Mike had trained in high-gravity environments, preparing for missions to heavy worlds where every step felt like carrying another person on his back. He couldn't stand, but he could survive. Mike spread himself flat against the floor, distributing his weight as evenly as possible. He controlled his breathing, keeping his blood moving despite the crushing pressure. His ribs ached and his spine compressed, but nothing broke. Human bones were built to handle stress, evolved from millions of years of running from predators and surviving falls. The Vrex cranked the gravity higher. Mike's bones creaked audibly, but they held. When gravity failed to flatten their test subject, the aliens tried temperature. The chamber became an oven, heating to levels that would have melted their own exoskeletons. Mike used every piece of his torn clothing to create insulation, layering fabric between himself and the superheated walls. When the temperature swung to the opposite extreme, turning the chamber into a freezer that would have shattered Vrex chitin like glass, Mike used his own body heat and the condensation forming on the walls. The water droplets that formed when hot air hit the suddenly cold surfaces became his drinking supply. Mike collected every drop he could reach, staying hydrated while the Vrex expected him to die of exposure. He'd learned water collection techniques during survival training in both desert and Arctic conditions, and the principles worked just as well in an alien death trap. Hours turned into days. Each time the Vrex thought they'd found the key to killing their stubborn prisoner, Mike found a way to adapt. When they combined radiation with high gravity, he used the metal debris as both shield and support structure. When they mixed poison gas with extreme temperatures, he adjusted his breathing apparatus and insulation accordingly. The aliens were no longer just confused, they were terrified. Mike could see in the way they moved around his chamber, always staying at a safe distance, as if his mere survival was somehow contagious. Their efficient scientific approach to extermination was being destroyed by a single human who refused to die. The lead scientist finally sent a transmission to the Vrex High Command that Mike could partially understand through their translation system. What manner of creature survives our death chambers? Request immediate consultation with biological warfare specialists. Subject continues to adapt to all termination protocols. Mike smiled through his improvised breathing mask. The Vrex were starting to learn what every human child discovers on the playground. Sometimes the scrappiest fighter wins not because they're strongest, but because they simply won't give up. By the third day, Mike had turned his prison into a home. He'd arranged the metal debris into a comfortable seating area, created a water collection system from torn fabric and condensation, and even figure out how to use the temperature fluctuations to dry his makeshift breathing filters. The Vrex scientists watching him had gone from excited anticipation to confused frustration to something that looked suspiciously like nervous respect. Mike knew he had their attention. More importantly, he knew they were starting to question everything they thought they knew about his species. It was time to educate them. He started simple, tapping against the chamber wall with a piece of metal debris. Not random banging, but patterns, mathematical sequences that any intelligent species would recognize. Prime numbers first, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, then the Fibonacci sequence. Basic geometric relationships, universal concepts that transcended language barriers. The lead scientist's head snapped up from its instruments. It clicked rapidly at the other researchers, pointing at Mike with one of its four arms. They'd been studying dozens of species for years, and they knew intelligence when they saw it. This wasn't random noise. Their test subject was trying to communicate. Within hours, they had activated their translation matrix, a complex system designed to decode and interpret alien languages. It took several attempts, but eventually, the mechanical voice spoke in Mike's head. Communication acknowledged. State your purpose. Mike almost laughed. His purpose? His purpose was to not die in their torture chamber, but he doubted they'd appreciate his sense of humor. Instead, he decided to give them something that might make them think twice about tangling with humanity in the future. You want to know why I'm still alive, Mike said, speaking slowly and clearly. You've tried everything in your arsenal, and I'm still here. You think your equipment is broken, but it's not. You just don't understand what you're dealing with. The Vrex scientists leaned closer to their monitoring equipment, recording every word. My species didn't evolve on a nice, safe world like yours, Mike continued. Earth tried to kill us from the day we first stood upright. We survived ice ages that lasted thousands of years, when most of the planet was frozen solid and food was so scarce that families had to choose who would eat and who would starve. He could see the aliens exchanging glances, their compound eyes reflecting the dim light of their instruments. We lived through plagues that killed half our population, Mike said, thinking of the history lessons he'd learned in school about the Black Death, smallpox, and dozens of other diseases that had swept through human civilization. Diseases that should have wiped us out completely. But we adapted. We learned. We survived. Mike stood up slowly, his movement still careful in the artificial gravity, but no longer labored. 3 days of living in their death chamber had actually made him stronger, more adapted to the conditions. You want to know why your poison gas doesn't kill me? Humans have been breathing toxic air for centuries. Our cities were so polluted that children grew up with lungs adapted to filter out chemicals that would choke other species. Your radiation doesn't stop me because we've been exposed to it since we discovered nuclear power. We've made mistakes with it, learned from those mistakes, and became resistant to levels that would kill most creatures in the galaxy. The lead scientist was perfectly still now, its sensor-covered head focused entirely on Mike's words. Your gravity torture? Humans have been living in different gravitational environments for generations. Some of us grew up on high-gravity mining worlds, others in the low gravity of space stations. Our bones adapted. Our muscles learned. Our hearts figured out how to pump blood, no matter what forces were working against them. Mike gestured around the chamber that had been his home for 3 days. You've thrown everything at me that would kill your own warriors instantly, and I'm still here. Not because I'm special, but because every human carries a genetic memory of millions of years of survival. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy, and we're definitely not the fastest. but we are absolutely the most stubborn. He looked directly at the observation window, where he knew they were watching. We refuse to die when there's still a chance to live. We refuse to give up when there's still something to fight for. And most importantly, we refuse to let anyone, no matter how advanced they think they are, decide that our story is over. The silence in the laboratory stretched for long minutes. Mike could almost hear the gears turning in their alien minds as they processed what he told them. Finally, the lead scientist's mechanical voice crackled through the communication system, but this time it wasn't addressing Mike. Mike heard it transmitting to what sounded like Vreck's high command. Urgent consultation required. If one human specimen can survive our complete arsenal of termination protocols, what would happen if we encountered their military forces? Recommend immediate revision of threat assessment protocols. For the first time since his capture, Mike allowed himself a genuine smile. The Vrecks were finally starting to understand that humanity wasn't just another species to be cataloged and disposed of. They were beginning to realize they'd picked a fight with creatures who had spent their entire evolutionary history learning that the only unforgivable sin was giving up, and that realization was making them very, very nervous. While the Vreck scientists argued among themselves about what to do with their impossible test subject, Mike had been putting his time to good use. 3 days of force observation had taught him more about alien technology than any human had ever learned before, and he was starting to see patterns that his captors probably never expected a primitive creature to understand. The Vrecks made the same mistake that many advanced civilizations made. They assumed that complex technology was beyond the comprehension of simpler species. But Mike had spent years working with cutting-edge human engineering, and more importantly, he had something the Vrecks didn't: the ability to see solutions that weren't in the instruction manual. Every time the aliens adjusted their atmospheric processors, Mike watched carefully. Every time they modified the gravity generators or temperature controls, he memorized the sequence of commands. The Vrecks were so confident in their superiority that they didn't bother hiding their control interfaces from him. Why would they? He was just a lab rat waiting to die. But humans had been reverse engineering technology since the first caveman picked up a stick and figured out how to make it sharper. Mike's brain was wired for pattern recognition in ways the insect-like aliens couldn't comprehend. Where they saw complex systems that required years of training to understand, he saw problems waiting to be solved. The breakthrough came when Mike realized that the atmospheric control system wasn't just pumping poison into his chamber. It was a closed-loop system that recycled air throughout the entire laboratory section. The Vrecks had built it that way for efficiency, never imagining that their own weapon could be turned against them. Mike waited until the night cycle, when only a skeleton crew of scientists remained in the laboratory. The aliens didn't sleep the way humans did, but they did have periods of reduced activity, when their metabolism slowed down. It was the closest thing to an opportunity he was going to get. Using a piece of metal debris he'd been sharpening against the chamber wall for days, Mike carefully worked at the atmospheric intake valve near the floor of his prison. The Vrecks had built their technology to be tamper-proof against their own kind, but they'd never designed it to resist human ingenuity and determination. It took him 2 hours of careful work, but finally, he managed to reverse the flow direction of the intake valve. Instead of pulling clean air into his chamber and pushing toxic air out, the system would now pump his chamber's poisonous atmosphere directly into the laboratory's main air supply. The effect was immediate and devastating. Alarms started blaring throughout the facility as the same yellow gas that had been meant to kill Mike began flooding the laboratory. The Vreck scientists stumbled around in confusion, their own atmospheric sensors screaming warnings about toxic contamination in areas that should have been safe. Mike watched through his observation window as the aliens who had tortured him for days began choking on their own weapon. They weren't dying. The concentration wasn't quite high enough for that, but they were definitely suffering, gasping and stumbling as they tried to evacuate the contaminated sections. That's when Mike made his move. The chamber's locking mechanism was electronic, tied into the same control systems that monitored the atmospheric processors. When the Vrecks had designed their death trap, they'd never considered that a prisoner might cause a facility-wide emergency that would trigger automatic safety protocols. As the contamination alarms reached critical levels, blast doors began sealing throughout the ship, but safety systems also began opening containment cells to prevent prisoners from suffocating if life support failed. Mike's chamber door hissed open for the first time in 4 days. He stepped into the chaos of the evacuating laboratory, breathing the same toxic air that was sending his captors into a panic. The makeshift filter he created from his clothing still protected him, and his adapted lungs handled the low concentration easily. To the fleeing Vrex, he must have looked like a demon rising from their own nightmares. The route to the shuttle bay wasn't difficult to find. Panicking aliens weren't subtle about which direction they were running. Mike followed the crowds of evacuating Vrex, staying low and moving fast. A few of the alien soldiers tried to stop him, but they were already weakened by the toxic atmosphere. While Mike was operating in conditions he'd grown accustomed to, he reached the shuttle bay just as the Vrex were sealing it off from the contaminated sections. A dozen small scout ships sat in neat rows, their fuel cells charged and ready for emergency evacuation. Mike had never flown an alien vessel before, but the control interfaces were surprisingly intuitive once he applied human problem-solving methods. The hardest part was getting past the bay doors, but the Vrex were so focused on containing their atmospheric emergency that they didn't expect a prisoner to steal one of their ships. By the time they realized what was happening, Mike was already accelerating away from their vessel at maximum burn. 3 days later, Lieutenant Tom Bradley of the Human Exploration Corps received a distress beacon from a frequency that had been silent for over a week. When he traced the signal, he found Mike Roberts sitting in the pilot seat of an alien scout ship, grinning like a man who just won the galaxy's most dangerous lottery. "Mike, how the hell did you survive?" Tom asked over the communication channel. "We've been searching for you since your ship went dark. Intelligence said the Vrex had taken you, and everyone knows what happens to their prisoners." Mike looked at the stolen alien technology surrounding him, then at the detailed scans and recordings he'd made of the Vrex ship systems and weaknesses. "They thought they knew everything about humans," Mike replied, his voice carrying a satisfaction that came from proving the impossible possible. "Turns out they had no idea what we're made of. The intelligence Mike brought back would change everything." The Vrex Empire had spent months hunting human explorers because they thought humans were weak, easily disposed of test subjects. But now they knew the truth. Humanity didn't just survive impossible odds. They learned from them, adapted to them, and eventually turned them into advantages. The Vrex would soon discover that they'd made a critical error in judgment. They'd tried to measure human endurance by their own standards, and that mistake was going to cost them dearly when they finally faced humanity's military forces. The galaxy's most efficient exterminators had just learned they'd picked a fight with the galaxy's most efficient survivors.